have to concede that, in fact, we are not making the changes on the scale that we need to make it. So one of the exercises I like to do with people that I speak to is I give them 3 options. And the question is, where are we in terms of addressing the climate crisis? So option 1 is no reason to panic. Our governments and businesses will get it together and come up with a solution and prevent the worst of the climate crisis, acknowledging that we're in the crisis already and we're seeing impacts. Option 2 is that the window of opportunity to turn things around is narrow and small and closing fast, but it's still within human creativity, ingenuity, and capability that can broaden out that window and turn things around. And option 3, I like to quote a sentence from the Afrikaans language from South Africa, which is derived from the Dutch. And even though you might not speak Dutch, I think when I tell you the third option, you'll be able to figure out what I'm saying. So the third option is, ons is deep, deep, deep in the kak. Okay, we're in a, okay, by your reaction, I can see that it doesn't need interpretation. So, and when I posed this question 5 years ago, option 1, there'll be about 2 to 3%, no need to panic, everything's fine. And option 2 used to have the bulk of the people saying that it's serious, but we can turn things around. And option 3 used to have maybe 2 or 3%. Today, 5 years later, when I continue to do the exercise, there's nobody in option 1, virtually. And the numbers for option 2, thankfully, still remain the largest, but there's now 20 to 30% of people saying it is actually too late. So it's within that context that we need something new and something that recognizes that the climate negotiating process and the COPs actually are delivering incremental progress and baby steps in the right direction, when what we need is seismic change. Our approach to various crises that emerge over time is, if you take the 1997 Asian financial crisis, or the 2008-2009 global financial crisis, or you take COVID itself, all of these crises were telling us that actually the system is broken to a large extent. And when we are in the middle of the crisis, you will hear quite transformative sort of visions presented. So, for example, during the 2008-2009 financial crisis, we had President Clinton at that time, the president of the World Bank, the Secretary General of the United Nations, and so on, all declaring that the world needs a new international financial architecture. However, once a Band-Aid is put over the problem and things stabilize, it's always business as usual. Even with COVID, you remember in the height of COVID, we had lots of political leaders around the world saying, build back better. When last did we hear that phrase, build back better? It's all gone back to a business as usual approach. So when we look at the climate negotiations itself, we find a very troubling reality. Only 2 years ago, at the climate negotiations in Sharm el-Sheikh in Egypt, that was the term fossil fuels even used, right? So why is it that the main cause of climate change, right, which is our addiction to oil, coal, and gas, only getting that recognition so late? The answer to that is very simple, that the power of the fossil fuel lobby is overwhelming. And if I ask the question, which is the largest delegation to each of the annual climate negotiations, it's not the host country, it's not the wealthiest countries. Just to give you an example, in the COP in Glasgow in 2021, you had actually the largest delegation 2 or 3 times bigger than the largest country delegation is the fossil fuel lobby. And it's important to just put that in context, right? That is like Alcoholics Anonymous having an annual conference, and the largest delegation to the conference is the alcohol industry. And they are obviously highly skilled lobbyists who are able to hold back progress. When we look at the vulnerability that we're experiencing right now, right, we see that in fact the greatest vulnerability is in the global south. And yeah, it's surprising that when we ask the question, what proportion of the world lives in the global south, right? And I'm going to pose that question to both of you or put you on the spot. What proportion of the global south, and no going to chat GPT quickly, Annika. What proportion of the global population lives in the global south? Anand?
Me, I'm going to say about a little less than 30%.
Well, you have it, unfortunately, on your slide. It's over 3.3 billion people that are living in the country classified as very high, which is the global south.
No. In the broader definition of global south, actually, it is more than 85% of the world's population
really?
lives in the global south. So it raises some really important questions about when we talk about the international community and so on. Actually, if you take all of Europe, North America, Canada and US, and Australia and New Zealand, which is geographically in the south but politically in the north, you're talking about a very small proportion of the world's population. But when we look at the domination of all our global processes, it's completely the other way around. So it is in that context that we now have come to the conclusion that we cannot continue to have outcomes from the climate negotiations which are not binding. By the way, the struggle to have a binding deal, at least in 2009, in the Copenhagen Climate Summit, the demand was, we want a fab deal. Not a fabulous deal, but a fair, ambitious, and binding deal. What we got in Copenhagen and what we've got subsequently is a FLAB deal, F-L-A-B, full of loopholes and BS. And so if we are wanting to move things forward, we have to push our governments into a binding treaty where people commit to. And that is why one of the most promising things in climate activism space right now is pushing for a binding treaty. What will this treaty seek to do? First is to get governments to agree that, knowing what we know, given the scale of the crisis that we're in, there should be no fresh investment in fields. Secondly, what we need is, in fact, a fastest phase out of fossil fuels as is humanly possible. And thirdly, to ensure that that transition happens in a fair and just manner. So the Non-Proliferation Treaty Initiative has been building the movement over the last couple of years. The exciting thing is that we've got 14 countries that have endorsed the process and are ready to start working on developing a treaty. Importantly, it includes 2 fossil fuel dependent countries, meaning that for the economy, they export fossil fuels, Colombia being one of them, and Timor-Leste, what used to be called East Timor, being the other. And so there is precedent for this. We have had various processes, but 3 that stand out is the Montreal Protocol, the Landmine Treaty, and the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. So there's different modalities in which a treaty can come about. And the idea is, once we have 30 countries in place, we can start negotiations. And once the negotiations start, you can be sure those countries that stay out will feel obliged to come in, because they wouldn't want it to be things against their own interest. And that's the theory anyway. So I want to now reflect a little bit on activism itself, and say that part of the problem is, if you look at civil society activity and where we put our energy, and if we were to say that there are three things forward at the macro, meso, micro level, by which I mean macro governance change, meso policy change, and micro projects, delivering of projects and programs. And if you look at the current levels of investment here, we're talking about, in terms of fundamental structure and systemic and governance change, probably 5% of philanthropic resources. At the policy level, 15%. That's increasing from where it used to be. And at a micro level, still most resources go into treating the symptoms of the problem rather than the root causes of the problem. So today, while philanthropy is a very big part of the solution, because even though the money that sits in philanthropy might have even come from fossil fuel profits or from other industries that exploit human rights and so on, there is increasingly, thankfully, a distance between where the money came from and what those institutions do. You are seeing conversations within philanthropy, for example, the Shifting Systems Initiative led by the Rockefeller Philanthropy Advisors, where they are bringing the philanthropic world together to try to say, hey, we can't simply be rearranging the deck chairs on the Titanic while humanity sinks. We have to ask the difficult questions, recognizing that the climate crisis is in fact a manifestation of the fact that our economic system is very much a contributor to it. Sadly, though, you could say that today we have more philanthropy rather than philanthropy, where a lot of money is going into things that are not bad in itself, but it's really tinkering with the most low-hanging fruits and not dealing with the most substantive problems of structural inequality and so on. The other thing that activism, while theoretically we know we need to do, and we were given this wisdom by the feminist movement decades ago, a rather cumbersome word, but a very powerful concept, intersectionality. And the fact that climate was put as an environmental issue rather than as a cross-cutting issue was a very, very grievous tactical and strategic error. Because to address the climate crisis, we need to see it as an economic crisis, a systemic crisis with our energy system, our food system, our transport system, and so on. And we are not doing that anywhere near what we should be doing. And unless we embrace intersectionality for folks in the global south, for their governments, for example, unless you can connect it with health, with water, with housing, with jobs, and show, for example, that if we invest in a bold way, in a just transition from an economy driven by dirty energy to an economy driven by clean energy, that in fact we don't get the kinds of impact that we need to. And so the fact that we have not made the struggle for climate justice a human-centric struggle has been a problem. And that has changed over the last 10 years, but has not changed sufficiently enough. The other issue is that we have to resist cognitive dissonance. And this, by the way, is not simply a problem for the academia or for the business sector. It's also a problem for activism. Because right now, you will find that we have been talking about keeping warming below 1.5 degrees, something we fought really hard for and achieved at the Paris climate negotiations in 2015. And maybe if I can just turn it over to both of you to see, where do you think we are in terms of the 1.5 degrees? Annika, Anand?
Yeah, so, We had a little bit of a discussion about this yesterday, and saying that, major stakeholders have still to sign on, and the pledge versus the actual commitment. There's a gap from the Paris agreements, and so governments are not playing where they need to play, for various reasons, of course, which include all of the above that you've mentioned, and including just simple politics, because of the sound bites. Annika?
I want to actually take a guess. I definitely think we're above it. I am from one of the countries that was flooded a couple of years ago in 2020, and know people that have actually drowned in those floods. So in Germany and Belgium, it's definitely warmer than 1.5 by a lot. We haven't had snow in many years.
So basically, we're pushing on 1.5 already. And still, in activism, we still say we want to keep it below 1.5, even though we're almost at 1.5. And depending how you count it, in some parts of the world, it's sort of exceeded it, right? So we're resisting the reality that science told us, because, there's two indicators here. Science has told us, keep it below 1.5 if you are going to stand a chance to secure the planet for future generations. And on the other hand, we are seeing the extreme weather events spike, both in frequency, ferocity, velocity, and so on. And, people in the Pacific, for example, already in 2015 were chanting a slogan which said 1.5 to stay alive. And that's what it means. And then, by the way, 6 months later, when we got to the Paris climate negotiations in 2015, the slogan had changed to 1.5, we might survive. Okay, so of course, the dominant parts of the world, which are in a minority, the so-called developed countries, they have a better capability to actually find the resources to recover from, say, for example, the flooding in Belgium and Germany in 2020. But what we are seeing is that a country like Kiribati, or spelled Kiribati, in the Pacific, has already had to lease land in Fiji on a 99-year lease to plan for the entire evacuation of 300,000 people to Fiji. So let's be very clear that we are resisting the fact that we are in a deep, deep crisis already. So commit to creative maladjustment is a thing that Martin Luther King gave to us in 1965 when he said, "My friends, as I come to the end of my speech, I want to note in the field of modern child psychology, there's a very dominant term called maladjusted. And all of us want to live a well-adjusted life and not suffer from schizophrenia or other mental illnesses. But my friends, I say to you, there are certain things in our world that are so unjust and immoral that good, decent people should refuse to be well-adjusted to." And then he goes on to say, "I never intend to adjust myself to racial discrimination, religious bigotry, and on the economy," he said, "I never intend to adjust myself to economic conditions that will take necessities from the many to give luxuries to the few, when millions of God's children are smothering in an airtight cage of poverty in an affluent society." If that was relevant in 1965 when I was 4 months old, I guarantee you it is 1,000 times more relevant. But we continue to actually pretend as if things are largely okay when things are already seriously falling apart for the vast majority of people around the world. So moving forward, we have to, if we want to get out of this malaise that we find ourselves in, some of us are advocating for the embracing of a culture of emergence. A culture of emergence refers to the process through which new cultural phenomena, patterns, or movements arise and become established within a society or community. So what does it mean practically? So yes, we can agree that we need to reduce emissions, increase gender equality, change our energy system and so on. But it doesn't mean we have to say we know exactly the detail of every step along the way. Because let's say before Russia invaded Ukraine, the world, and if you take the commitments for the European Union, and what European Union was urging the global South and others to do, was a much more ambitious and bold response to the climate crisis. But what we see is, in fact, the war happens and suddenly Germany and everybody else basically says, oh, our people are so precious, they need to have energy, so doesn't matter, we've been telling the world we're making all these commitments, we will start, just completely compromising. So when something like that happens, then we have to adapt. So we're living in a world of ultra fluidity at the moment, and to have any organization, for example, that does a 5-year strategic plan right now, will find that probably within 3 years, if that, they're going to have to go back and change it, because some of the fundamentals change in such a substantive way. So for us in activism, if I can just focus on that, one of my biggest errors that I've made over the years is mistaking access for influence. So if I look at when apartheid ended in South Africa and when the Berlin Wall came down in '89, suddenly citizens around the world had access to decision-making, being consulted for government white papers, green papers, and so on. And we ran to those meetings as we run to the COPs, right, in the hope that our efforts here will give us a positive outcome. And we actually thought by us being here, we have influence, right? But in reality, we simply had access without influence. And the access also is not necessarily wholesome access to those in power. So I'm not saying that we shouldn't engage with government and business from activism side. Of course, we need to do that. But our proportionality is not right. We still focus more on looking at those with power, hoping and appealing to their sense of conscience to do the right thing. And we actually don't look downwards to those that are powerless, and to recognize that unless we mobilize and organize those folks, right, we don't get the critical mass that we need to actually move things forward in the way that we need to. So the Fridays for the Future movement, which was made famous by Greta Thunberg, they now dismiss engagement with government as handshake activism, right? That, it's just not worth the time and the effort. So right now, building public awareness of the problem that we face is critically important. And then when we diagnose why is it that climate activism is not winning big enough or fast enough, then we come to the understanding that most of our narratives and messages have been aimed at the brain. Science, policy, facts and figures, lots of acronyms, degrees, parts per million, all of that stuff has all been aimed at the brain, and we ignore the heart, the body, and the soul. And if you look, for example, at Steve Bannon and Donald Trump, they bypass the brain completely and they go straight to the heart, and they weaponize every kind of hate that you can imagine. Right now, I'm not saying we should do what they do, which is lie on a monumental scale. But bottom line is, we cannot be as boring with the facts as we are. People are not moved into action, especially working class people who are time poor and so on. They're not moved into action by, concepts and jargon that they don't understand, if I can just give you a quick example here. When I was the Secretary General of Amnesty International, a very talented and one of the world's leading artists, Olafur Eliasson from Iceland, called me up and said in September of 2019, Kumi, can you join me can you please come to Iceland? And I'm also trying to get Mary Robinson to come. the former UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, on such and such a date. And I said, what's happening in Iceland, Olafur? And he said, we're having a funeral. I said, oh, I'm so sorry, who passed away? And he said, an iceberg, right? And on an early Saturday morning, I was at the bottom of this iceberg with Mary Robinson, the Prime Minister of Iceland, and myself. We made a few comments, and we walk up this dead iceberg, the first iceberg to die. And what that means is it's not coming back. It's dead, it's gone, right? And there was a plaque that was put there which said, ironically, the name of the iceberg in Icelandic was okay, and clearly this iceberg was not okay. And it said, okay is the first iceberg to die. At this moment of history, we know what needs to be done. If you are reading this plaque here, hopefully it means that we acted as humanity to do what we needed to do. It's, by the way, said much more eloquently than I just tried to capture there. There was a choir that sang funeral songs and so on. When I evaluate the impact of that event, it had much more impact in terms of global communications and so on, and impact than 95% of the actions that happened under my leadership when I was at Greenpeace International. And when I tried to process why it was, media pickup and so on, it's because everybody understands loss and death, right? Everybody is lost either through death, a loved one, or even when a relationship ends and it's brutally painful. People can connect to that. They don't need to know the details of the climate science and what rate the glaciers are melting in the Arctic and the Antarctic and so on. So part of what we have to do moving forward is to talk about the challenge of biodiversity loss, climate change, and so on, in ways in which we can move people, in their heart, body, and soul. If we fail to do that, we will continue to reach only a very small minority of people. So I just want to end with this slide, where the biggest flaw I see in the way we've prosecuted activism and how it has evolved over time is that because the starting point of activism is how people are oppressed, marginalized, repressed, exploited, and so on, we end up thinking that people actually have much less agency than in reality they still have, right? And for me, it's astounding, even though colonialism, part of its agenda was to decimate and destroy indigenous knowledge systems and so on. I'm here in Colombia, where there's a large, at the COP, a large delegation of talented and brilliant and knowledge-bearing leaders from indigenous communities around the world. And it is amazing to see, notwithstanding all the brutality that colonialism brought to them in the Americas, in Australia, in Africa, and elsewhere, that they managed to hold on to some of those systems which now need to be lifted up. So, and what you're looking at the moment, this slide, I did this during COVID, and I just adapted it slightly for this, which is a response to that problem, because you have to read each of those quadrants, starting from the middle, where we remind ourselves people have power as, and I've got it in 4 quadrants: harnessing autonomy, harnessing of creative participation, harnessing of wealth, and harnessing of consumption. And not to go through all of them, but just to take a few examples. So people have power as litigators, citizens, and voters, as shapers of our destiny through movements like trade unions and faith organizations and so on. Then if you look at harnessing our wealth, people have power as owners of bank accounts and other investments. Now you might think, okay, poor people, how much of money they have. I'll just give you an example. In Australia, in 2015, when we were trying to stop the biggest coal mine in Australia's history being built, and that struggle continues, we mobilized citizens across Australia to go to banks and to put pressure on banks with a message, don't fund the death of our children and grandchildren. And whether you had $5 in the bank account or $5 million in the bank account, it didn't really matter. And we managed to get all Australian banks to say they wouldn't fund it, right? Of course, governments can come up with various other lending instruments and so on, which is what they did, but we slowed it down and we reduced the scale of it. And then I'll just quickly go to harnessing our creative participation. I am not suggesting that Artivism, that is bringing together arts, culture, and activism on its own, will deliver us the salvation from the climate crisis and the intersecting crisis. However, I am today very much of the view, if we fail to harness the power of arts and culture to break the communications deficit of activism, we will most certainly fail. So with those words, I'm happy to offer that as a introductory framing and take any questions that you might have. Thank you.
Yeah, Kumi, that was wonderful. I mean, I think it is amazing how you've put it together so succinctly. When we are in discussions in this particular conference, what we are finding is, to start with philanthropic, there is a divide between the previous generation and the next generation. And the next generation is more aware, but not necessarily active. So there's conversation, but not real result. So you have leadership within the young people that are trying to build that consensus, but the problem is we have a siloed approach. So if 10 different foundations are doing something in Mali, they're not necessarily coordinating or sharing efforts. How do you address this part of it?
So with extreme difficulty is the short answer.
Of course.
Because there's often, let me just give you a very simple thing here, right? That foundations can do. So in universities in the United States and elsewhere, in the old days, when you had to apply for admission to a university, you had to singularly apply to every single university that you wanted to get into. Today, you can apply through a common process with the same application form and access multiple universities, right? And I've been advocating for this when I was Secretary General of Civicus, World Alliance for Citizen Participation, already in the late 1990s, right? Where I said, is it rocket science for you guys to get your act together and come up with one application form so that you are not putting the burden of so much of transactional costs onto the people who are seeking the funding? And is it rocket science for you all to come up with one reporting format so that people can actually spend less time on managing the relationships with the funding sources and actually doing the actual work? In fact, to a large extent, I'll give you an example. When I was the leader of the adult literacy movement in South Africa, sometimes I would find that the amount of staff time that went into developing the proposal and reporting on the proposal was actually equal to the sum of what was given, right? And this is a common problem. So how we do it is move from philanthropy to philanthropy, okay? We have to reduce transactional costs. We have to make it more enabling and so on. And we have to say to governments, especially in the global north, who love flag planting, right? If they support a project, they want to put a big flag with their country and so on. All of these things are meaningless. It is simply a misreading of how deep the crisis that we find ourselves in, right? And what the science says is that once we overshoot 1.5 and certainly 2 degrees, we are now in a world of irreversible, catastrophic, runaway climate change, right? And the word irreversible is a word that we have to look at seriously, because at some point we reach a tipping point where we cannot recover. We are just within the window that we are not beyond irreversible, right? But we are getting close to it. Let's be very clear. For some people in the world, it's already irreversible. I live in a city called Durban. I grew up in a city called Durban. And in 2022, in 2 days, 450 people died just like that. Hundreds of millions of dollars in infrastructure costs, in infrastructure loss, and so on. For those people who died, it was too late for them. For the people that had died recently in the US through the hurricane and cyclone that we've seen here, which impacted on 5 states and so on. And, I can give you much more horrific statistics. You go to Pakistan, 20 million people displaced by extreme flooding several years ago and so on. So when we have that kind of crisis, then the solution has to be putting down pettiness, putting down our political posturing, and recognize that what is needed is a deep moral courage to actually make the changes that we need to make on a scale that we've never made before. So let me just say that each of the crises that I mentioned earlier of, say, the Asian financial crisis in 97, the global financial crisis, and COVID, all of these were teachable moments, right? We could have learned from it and summoned the courage to say, hey, these things showed that the majority of people in the world are left vulnerable. So what is our approach when we come out of the crisis? It's all about system recovery, system protection, and system maintenance, when what is needed urgently is system innovation, system redesign, and system transformation. And that is the mentality we have to bring into our politics right now.
I couldn't agree with you more. I think that, as we all have discussions, what we're coming to realize is governments are reactionary. Governments are not good at planning. Governments are not good at forecasting. They react to events. If there's a hurricane, they go in, they fix it. There's an earthquake in Pakistan, everybody jumps in and says, okay, how do we get food to them? How do we get water to them? But what are we doing for the future? There's no actual, plan that's going to be built from that. So the teachable moment is always being left behind. But one of the more kind of interesting issues I wanted to kind of get your opinion on is we have multiple priorities within climate change, but also, as you said, within gender, within equality, within all of these. Sometimes it seems like we keep switching focus, and then the environment falls back. So, we talked a little bit about Germany. A few years ago, the Greens were on an upswing. Today, it's the radical right, because now that's a reaction to migration. So, I mean, how do we unify the issues? Because at the end of the day, somebody said yesterday, a young family office person yesterday said, the biggest problem is what we're not realizing is that the UN SDGs are built on the fact that the planet has to survive first. Then everything else will work. What good is gender equality if we're not going to be alive?
So 2 responses to that, Anand.
Yeah.
One is, this is the point I'm trying to make when I say we have to turbocharge intersectionality. Yep. By putting these issues in silos and not understanding that they're connected is a fundamental problem of how we're addressing things. So for me, there can be no climate justice without gender justice, right? If you take the reality that even the CIA and the Pentagon acknowledge that in the coming decades, that the biggest threat to peace, security, and stability will come not from conventional threats or terrorism, will come from the impacts of climate change, right? And we know in all wars, right? Women and children pay the biggest burden of those impacts, right? So, so in the past, our failure to understand the intersectionality of the different issues, the most important is employment, right? And jobs, right? So what we say in the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty is that initiative. What we are saying is that we need to recognize, if we get serious about making the transition from an economy driven by dirty energy to an economy driven by clean energy, amongst other things, then actually, if you did it well, if you did it boldly, you actually can have a jobs bonanza, right? Because you'd have to retrofit most of our buildings that exist to make them more energy efficient, right? That can have a boost in the construction industry. Even going to very specific things like urine separation technology, where we have toilets built where urine goes into one place and feces goes into the other place. Sorry to bring the conversation to a somewhat shitty level, but just to say that feces, human feces, which actually pollutes water sources and so on because we don't manage it properly, is what buses in Uppsala, Sweden are run on, right? Or in Bristol, I jokingly said to the African Union leadership on the 50th anniversary of the formation of the Organization of African Unity in Addis Ababa, I pointed out the fact that human feces was being processed and used as energy to run buses. And I said to them, I refuse to accept that European shit is better than African shit. We just have to get our shit together and turn the crisis of climate change into an opportunity, right? And of course, urine has the capability of being processed for fertilizers and so on. So I take an example like that, which is, not, it's probably the first time most people will hear this example, and I'm not sure the technology is there 100% already. But unless we think about waste management together with, because waste management is a huge problem in terms of impact on biodiversity loss. So yeah, so our governments though, there's one thing you said earlier, Anand, that I just want to pick up, and that is you said our governments, seem to not be able to plan, to move us in the direction that we are. And yeah, I want to just reference a piece of work that I did for the Green Economy Coalition during COVID and shortly after COVID, which was pushing for a new social contract. By social contract, simply what is the terms of commitment between citizens and governments, okay? What do governments commit to? What do citizens contribute? And what can citizens expect? And when I started this work, I kept saying the social contract is broken and we need a new social contract. But now I've come to realize, actually, the social contract is not broken. The social contract is working exactly as it was designed and planned for, which is to serve a minority of people, dominant interests in different societies, and just manage the majority and make sure that they have enough crumbs that they will not rise up and resist the extreme inequality that we have, that the capitalist system, gives us. So I'm not sure today whether it's the absence of planning. I think for the individual member of parliament, the individual civil servant and so on, who finds themselves locked in those systems, many of them act with goodwill and decency and trying to make the best of a bad system. Yes, they're trying to plan the best they can within a broken system. But I think the power brokers, the real people that control our industries and so on, and let's be blunt about it, it's not as if the warnings were not there. Eisenhower, when he was stepping up as president of the United States, in his final speech, he said, I warn you to be careful of the rising power of the military-industrial complex and what we could today call the military-industrial fossil fuel complex, right? because unbridled power given to these sectors of the economy will undermine democracy and fundamentally threaten human welfare. That's a warning that we ignored. That's not a left-wing activist saying that. That's the former president of the United States saying that. And if you go back and look at anything that activism is saying today, like the radical move to the fast transition to renewable energy. I mean, Jimmy Carter put solar panels in the White House, right? Which I believe Ronald Reagan removed the moment he came there. You know, it's not as if energy security is a new agenda and so on. It's been there for a long time. Sorry, Annika.
No, not at all. I was going to ask a follow-up question about that because we live in the global north, as you put it, in a very capitalist society, in that system. So my question to you would be, how do we make change financeable for those companies? Because we see it now. We see it with direct, indirect, and half election interference, right, from companies. But we have seen very positive examples. We've seen things like tokenized non-production in oil fields in Iceland, right? What else can be done that involves companies so that we can entice them as we entice the masses over here to play ball?
So firstly, the role of government should be to manage the competing interests in society, right? On one end, you got capital and business. On the other hand, you got civil society and different interests in society. The problem is most of our governments are no longer balancing those interests. They are basically serving one small proportion of society, which is the business interests. And so we have to, the starting point, I think, is the restating of governance and changing what we understand to be the role of government. And yeah, maybe I can quote Julius Nyerere, the founding president of Tanzania, when he was once asked about many countries in Africa having one-party states, and he said, by an American journalist, and he said, well, you know, when I look at the United States, you know, in many societies in Europe at that time, anyway, you had at least one party that was, you know, serving the interests of capital, and then you usually had a Labour Party or a Social Democratic Party or a Socialist Party, which was advancing the interests of working people. And he said, well, when I look at the United States, it sounds like both your parties advance the interests of big business and capital. And then he said, but and I consider you all a one-party state. It's just that in typical American extravagance, you have two of them, right? But how do you do it? Is you actually have to address certain fundamental things about how our economic system has to be reconfigured, right? And we have to reduce inequality. Like, I mean, come on. How is it, if you go look at CEO compensation over the last 75 years, it's ridiculous how it has spiked and spiked and spiked. You cannot tell me that the value a CEO brings is that precious when they are destroying the planet to a large extent, right? Breeding inequality, excluding a lot of people, climate impacts and so on. So I would go to say that unless we are willing to have a serious look at the systemic problems with capitalism. And by the way, I'm saying post-capitalism, not anti-capitalism necessarily, right? Because it doesn't help us to, because once you say you're anti-capitalist, it's just
you're no longer a voice. Yeah. No, absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah. One final thing. Our next panel is, and we've done this all 3 days, is children from around the world that are engaged in climate. So we will have about 7 children that will be there and discussing how they do. What is your message to these children and to people in general, and how to engage, how to be the micro activist that they can be, and how to dream to be the next Kumi?
So the main message to young people is that when people in my generation say to you, young people are the leaders of tomorrow, don't accept that. If you wait for a tomorrow, there is not going to be a tomorrow for you to take leadership. You have to bring your voice, your participation, your creativity, your perspective into the public space now. If you fail to do that, time is just against us and you won't be able to do that. The second thing is to young people to say, my generation let you down badly. Young girls should not be asking questions like, should I be having kids, which young girls are asking all over around the world. That's a horrible situation that we put our young people into. And while you stand up and struggle for your future, don't let the systems that you find around you deprive you of your childhood. Do it in a way that you celebrate each other, have fun, dance, sing, build community, and make your efforts at change joyful, soulful, empowering to yourselves, because the road ahead is going to be difficult. And unless we can laugh, sing, and dance through it all, it's going to be a very, very difficult reality, because let's be blunt about it. We are facing a global mental health crisis right now as a result of eco-anxiety and climate anxiety. And our young children are carrying the burden of it, because young children also need to bring to the public domain fresh lenses of looking at old intractable problems in new ways. So that, as my daughter once told me when I said, you should do things this way and you shouldn't do it, from my experience, she said, Dad, but basically your experience is contaminated by really bad experience and your generation keeps pushing bad experience on us. So don't, respect our elders, but don't respect the mess institutionally that they've given us and systemically that they've given us. Push back on that, and don't feel shy to tell us that y'all have failed us and you'll need to make space for new ideas to emerge and new perspectives to be brought to old intractable problems. Because only young people can bring that. All of us are far too contaminated by a broken system that just doesn't work.
Kumi, it has been an absolute honor and a pleasure to have you. We could continue this for hours with you, but we've got to hop on to the next panel. So I greatly appreciate it. On behalf of Davos Worldwide, we completely wish you all the best with these the current COP negotiations and your access. And hopefully it does become productive and you are able to influence how policy goes. And from the bottom of our hearts, we say thank you so much for joining us, and your message will be carried.
Thank you so much for all your work.
Thank you, Annika.
It continues. Without you, we would have one less bright light.
Thank you, Annika. Thank you, Anand. Good luck with your efforts. Best wishes.
So much. Best wishes.